Inspector Lestrade removed his gloves with care, folding them once before tucking them into his coat pocket, and consulted the small leather notebook he carried everywhere, its corners softened by years of case notes, its pages swollen slightly from London rain. The morning air held that particular cold that comes after fresh snow, clean and sharp, carrying the faint scent of coal smoke from neighbouring chimneys and the ghost of bread, baking somewhere down the terrace. He stood at the threshold of the third-floor boudoir, listening to Constable Hendricks deliver his report in the earnest, over-precise manner of a young officer hoping to be noticed, and felt the familiar weight of professional worry settle across his shoulders, polite, restrained, but present none the less. The room itself was elegant in that careful Victorian way, pale blue wallpaper printed with silver filigree, a dressing table laden with cut glass bottles that caught the weak winter light, a four-poster bed with embroidered linens pulled tight as drumheads, everything in its place, everything accounted for, except, of course, the jewel box, a lacquered thing of modest size, dark wood inlaid with mother of pearl, now absent from the dressing table where it had sat for 3 years without incident, and except for the footprints. Lestrade stepped carefully to the balcony doors, noting the intact bolt, the undisturbed latch, the frame flush against, its seals, locked from within. The household had been clear on that point. The lady of the house had checked it herself before retiring, as she did every night during winter months when the wind rattled old glass. The maid had found it still locked at dawn when she came to open the curtains. Yet the jewel box had vanished, and outside, pressed into 4 inches of overnight snow along the narrow balcony, were the prints. He pushed open the doors now, unbolted by the first constable on scene, regrettably, though the man had at least thought to sketch their position first, and stepped out into the cold. The balcony was barely 3 feet deep, bordered by an iron railing painted black, flaked with age. Below, the street lay muffled under its white blanket, morning traffic only just beginning to carve muddy tracks through the snow. Across the way, identical townhouses stood shoulder to shoulder, their windows reflecting pale sky, their rooftops crowned with snow that had not yet begun its slow slide toward gutters. And there, impossibly, were the footprints. They began 2 feet from the balcony door, as if the person who made them had simply appeared mid-stride. No trail leading in from the corners, no ladder marks against the wall, no disturbance in the snow along the railing where someone might have climbed over. The prints ran for perhaps 6 feet, 4 clear impressions, the right foot slightly deeper than the left, and then they ended just as abruptly in the middle of the balcony's length, as if the walker had simply stopped existing. Lestrade crouched, his knees protesting faintly, and studied the nearest print with the attention he'd learned to bring to details that refused to make sense. The edges were clean, almost sharp, carved into the snow with a precision that struck him as wrong. When a man walks through snow, his foot compresses and shifts the material, creating a depression with irregular borders, packed harder at the center, looser at the rim. These prints had none of that texture. The depth was uniform throughout. Exactly uniform, he noted, checking each print in turn. 1 3/4 inches, no variation. He straightened slowly, brushing snow from his fingertips, and looked out across the rooftops. The neighbouring buildings were close, 10 feet, perhaps 12, between this terrace and the next, possible to cross with a plank or ladder. But there were no marks in the snow on those roofs, no evidence of disturbance, and still no explanation for how someone could leave prints that began and ended in empty air. Behind him, in the warmth of the boudoir, the maid was weeping softly. A girl of perhaps 19, her cap askew, her hands twisted together in her apron. She had been the one to discover the theft, she who had looked out at dawn and seen the prints and screamed, convinced, she told Constable Hendricks, that the devil himself had visited in the night. The household's groom, a quiet man named Thomas, a limp from an old carriage accident, had been accused by the cook of witchcraft. The neighbour from 2 doors down, a widow of theatrical inclination, had stood in her own doorway that morning and pronounced it the devil's step, loud enough for half the street to hear. Superstition spread faster than influenza in London's terraces, Lestrade knew. Old fears dressed in new clothes, eager for any mystery that resisted easy explanation. And this mystery, he had to admit, resisted very well indeed. He returned inside, closing the balcony doors behind him, and watched the bustle of investigation that filled the room. Constable Hendricks measuring the distance from door to railing. Another constable dusting the dressing table for fingerprints. A new technique, still regarded with suspicion by some of the older men at Scotland Yard. But Lestrade believed in trying all tools. The lady of the house, Mrs. Violet Ashford, sat in a chair by the window, her hands folded in her lap, her face composed but pale. She had not slept, he could see. None of them had. "Inspector!" Constable Hendricks approached with his notebook open, pencil poised. The jewel box contained 3 items, according to Mrs. Ashford. A garnet brooch, a pearl necklace of modest quality, and a gold locket with her late mother's portrait. Total value perhaps £30. Not insignificant, but hardly the target one might expect for such elaborate methods. Lestrade nodded slowly. That was another piece that did not fit. £30 was enough to tempt a desperate man, certainly, but this crime, if crime it was, had required planning. The snow had begun falling only yesterday evening, heavy and sudden, the kind of storm that surprised even London's weather-worn residents. Whoever made those prints had done so in the narrow window between Snowfall's End, around midnight, by Lestrade's estimation, and dawn, a window of perhaps 5 hours. To prepare a method this peculiar, this theatrical, for such modest gain seemed disproportionate. Unless, of course, the point was not the jewels, but the spectacle, the fear, the strangeness of it. He moved to the dressing table, examining the space where the box had sat. No scratches on the wood, no sign of haste. The bottles around it remained perfectly arranged, their glass stoppers seated, their positions undisturbed. Whoever took the box had lifted it cleanly, carefully, as if they had all the time in the world. "The door was watched, you said?" Lestrade asked Mrs. Ashford, his voice gentle. She nodded, her voice steady, despite her evident distress. "My husband was in his study, directly across the hall, until past 1 in the morning. He would have heard anyone on the stairs. Our room is at the end of the corridor. No one could pass without us knowing. And the servants? All accounted for. Cook and the scullery maid share a room in the attic. Thomas sleeps above the stable. Our housemaid, Jenny," she gestured to the weeping girl, "has the small room on the 2nd floor, near the landing. None of them could have reached this floor without being seen or heard." It was a locked room puzzle, or near enough. The kind of thing that made Lestrade's colleagues at Scotland Yard throw up their hands and blame ghosts or cunning magicians. But Lestrade did not believe in ghosts. He believed in men, and in the clever, sometimes desperate things men did when pressed by need or greed or fear. Somewhere in this room, in these prints, in the careful staging of impossibility, was a human answer. He simply could not see it yet. He thanked Mrs. Ashford and stepped into the hallway, where the winter light fell pale through a landing window, illuminating dust motes that drifted like tiny, slow snowflakes. The house was quiet now. The initial panic settled into the heavy waiting that followed all crimes, waiting for answers, for resolution, for the moment when the world made sense again. Lestrade descended the stairs slowly, his hand trailing along the polished banister, his mind turning over the evidence like a man examining a puzzle box for hidden seams. The prints were the key, he felt certain. Too deliberate to be accidental, too strange to be simple. But they defied every pattern he knew. In the front hall, Constable Hendricks waited with the preliminary report and the sketch he'd made of the prints. Careful work, Lestrade noted approvingly, showing the dimensions and spacing with a draftsman's precision. He studied it in the gaslight that hissed softly from the wall sconce, and felt that quiet pressure of responsibility that came with being the man expected to have answers. He had worked murder cases where the method was brutal and the motive clear as daylight. He had worked thefts where the criminal's carelessness practically wrote the arrest warrant for him. He had worked frauds that unravelled with patient accounting. But this felt different. This felt like a case that would sit in his files, unsolved, a thorn in his professional pride, unless he admitted what he had been resisting since the moment he saw those impossible prints. This was a case for Sherlock Holmes. The thought did not bring shame, exactly. Lestrade had worked with Holmes before, and while the man's methods could be infuriating, his dismissal of official procedure, his theatrical pronouncements, his maddening habit of withholding conclusions until the last possible moment, Lestrade had learned to respect the results. Holmes saw things. He saw connections where others saw only disconnected facts. He saw stories written in dust and scratches, and the particular way a man tied his bootlaces. And Lestrade, for all his pride in Scotland Yard's methods, for all his faith in patient investigation and systematic inquiry, knew when he was stuck. He folded the constable's sketch carefully and tucked it into his notebook. Outside, through the hall window, he could see the snow beginning to melt where the sun touched it, dripping from eaves in a rhythm like a slow clock. The city was waking fully now, carriages rattling past, vendors calling their wares, the great mechanism of London turning as it always did, indifferent to small mysteries in third-floor boudoir. But Lestrade was not indifferent. He was, above all things, a man who finished what he started. And if finishing this required setting aside his pride and making the journey to Baker Street, then so be it. He pulled on his gloves, settled his hat, and stepped out into the cold morning, where his breath misted in the air, and the snow crunched beneath his boots with that satisfying sound of winter giving way to weight. A hansom cab waited at the corner, its driver hunched against the cold, the horse's breath steaming. "Baker Street," Lestrade said, climbing aboard. The driver nodded, and they rolled forward into the waking city, toward a cluttered sitting room, where a man who saw impossible things might make the impossible clear. The hansom cab moved through London, with the gentle rhythm of hoofs on snow-muffled cobblestones, a sound softer than the usual clatter of iron shoes on stone, almost hypnotic in its regularity. Lestrade settled back against the worn leather seat, his notebook resting on his knee, and watched the city pass beyond the cab's small window. The streets were coming alive with morning commerce, though the snow had slowed everything to a more deliberate pace. Carts moved carefully, their wheels cutting dark tracks through white, and pedestrians picked their way along pavements where shopkeepers had already begun the work of clearing paths with shovels and brooms. The air outside held that peculiar mixture of scents that defined winter mornings in the capital. Coal smoke from 10,000 chimneys, mingling with the yeasty warmth that escaped from bakeries when their doors opened. The sharp, clean smell of snow itself, and underneath it all, the faint mineral tang of the Thames. Always present even when the river lay hidden beneath fog and distance. Lestrade breathed it all in, feeling the cold sting his nostrils, and found it oddly centering. London in winter was a harder city than London in spring, but there was an honesty to it. The cold did not dissemble, the snow revealed what the streets usually hid, and the smoke rose straight and true in the still air. They passed through Bloomsbury, where the British Museum's great columns stood dignified under their crown of snow, and skirted the edge of Soho, where market vendors had erected makeshift coverings over their stalls. Canvas stretched on poles to keep the worst of the weather off their goods. A coffee seller called out his wares, his voice carrying sharp in the cold air, and Lestrade caught the scent of roasted beans, rich and dark, a small comfort against the morning chill. The cab turned onto Baker Street, and Lestrade felt the familiar tightening of anticipation that always preceded his visits to number 221B. It was not nervousness, exactly. He had faced down armed criminals and walked through crime scenes that would have turned a civilian's stomach. But Holmes had a way of making a man feel slightly inadequate, as if one had been reading a book upside down without realizing it. Still, if the case required Holmes's peculiar genius, then professional duty required setting aside personal discomfort. The cab drew to a halt, and Lestrade paid the driver, adding an extra sixpence for the careful navigation through snow-laden streets. The man touched his cap in thanks, and the cab rolled away, leaving Lestrade standing before the familiar door with its brass number plate polished to a shine despite the weather. He knocked, a firm, official knock, the kind that announced police business without aggression, and waited. From within came the sound of footsteps descending stairs, and then the door opened to reveal Mrs. Hudson, the landlady, her face brightening with recognition. "Inspector, Lestrade," she said warmly, stepping aside to admit him. "Come in from the cold, do. Terrible weather we're having, though I suppose it's pretty enough if one doesn't have to be out in it. Mr. Holmes and Dr. Watson are upstairs. I've just brought up tea, so the timing's fortunate." Lestrade stepped into the narrow hallway, stamping snow from his boots onto the mat, and felt the immediate relief of warmth after the street's bitter cold. The house smelled of beeswax and coal fire, underlaid with the faint medicinal scent that seemed to cling to all doctors' residences, even when the doctor in question had long since traded active practice for the more irregular occupation of chronicling detective work. "Thank you, Mrs. Hudson," Lestrade said, removing his hat and smoothing his hair. "I hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all, not at all. Mr. Holmes has been rather restless these past few days. Not enough to occupy him, I think. A case will do him good." She gestured toward the stairs, with a knowing smile. "Up you go, Inspector. You know the way." Lestrade climbed the 17 steps. He had counted them once during a wait on a previous visit, and emerged onto the familiar landing. The door to 221B stood slightly ajar, and through it came the sound of a violin being tuned, the notes wandering up and down the scale with no particular melody. Just Holmes, testing the strings with that absent-minded precision he brought to all physical tasks. Lestrade knocked on the doorframe and pushed the door open. The sitting room was exactly as he remembered it, a organized chaos that somehow never quite tipped into true disorder. Books lay open on every surface. Newspapers were stacked in precarious towers. Chemical apparatus cluttered one corner of the table, and the Persian slipper that served as Holmes' tobacco pouch hung from the mantelpiece like a strange, defeated banner. The fire burned bright and warm in the grate, casting dancing light across the room, and the morning sun came through the window in pale shafts, illuminating the pipe smoke that drifted in lazy spirals toward the ceiling. Sherlock Holmes stood by the window, violin in hand, his tall, lean figure silhouetted against the winter light. He wore his purple dressing gown over shirt and trousers, his feet in worn leather slippers, and his hair was uncombed, the look of a man who had been awake for some time, but had not yet conceded to the social demands of the day. At Lestrade's entrance, he lowered the violin and turned, his grey eyes sharp and assessing even before he spoke. "Lestrade," he said, his voice carrying that dry, precise tone that could make even a greeting sound like the conclusion of a logical proof. "You bring a case, I perceive. Something that has you sufficiently puzzled to overcome your preference for handling Scotland Yard's business without consulting private detectives. The snow is involved, obviously, and the crime occurred in a respectable household. Kensington or Bloomsbury, I should say, given your route here." From his chair by the fire, Dr. John Watson looked up from the notebook in which he had been writing. His pen paused mid-sentence. He was a contrast to Holmes in every way. Solid, where Holmes was angular; warmly conventional, where Holmes was coolly eccentric. His military bearing softened by years of domestic life, but still evident in his posture. He smiled at Lestrade with genuine welcome. "Inspector, good morning. Don't let Holmes's parlour tricks discourage you. He's been staring out the window for the past hour, watching hansom cabs go by, so he had plenty of warning. Do sit down. Tea?" Lestrade allowed himself a small smile and moved to the chair Watson indicated, a comfortable piece, worn smooth by use. "Thank you, Doctor. Tea would be most welcome." Watson poured from the pot Mrs. Hudson had brought up. Good, strong tea, dark as polished mahogany, steaming gently, and handed Lestrade a cup. The inspector wrapped his cold hands around it gratefully, feeling the warmth seep into his fingers, and took a sip. Perfect. Mrs. Hudson understood that men who spent their mornings in unheated crime scenes needed their tea to carry substance as well as comfort. Holmes set his violin aside with care, laying it in its open case on the sideboard, and settled into his own chair with the angular grace of a folding crane. He steepled his fingers beneath his chin, his elbows resting on the chair's arms, and fixed Lestrade with that unwavering attention that made the inspector feel as though he were being read like one of the newspapers stacked around the room. "Now then," Holmes said, "tell me everything, and pray don't omit any detail, however trivial it may seem. Watson will take notes. He has a passion for recording the peculiar, and if your expression is any indication, this case qualifies." Lestrade set his teacup on the small table beside his chair and drew out his notebook, opening it to the pages he had filled that morning. He had learned, over several collaborations, that Holmes preferred facts delivered in order, without editorializing or theory, so he began with the essential framework. "The theft occurred last night at the Ashford residence, a townhouse on Welbeck Street," he said. "Mrs. Violet Ashford discovered at dawn that a jewel box had been taken from her third-floor boudoir. The box contained items worth approximately £30, modest value, nothing extraordinary. The room was locked from within, the door watched by Mr. Ashford across the hall until past 1 in the morning. No one could have entered through conventional means." Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly, interest kindling. "But they did enter through unconventional means, I take it." "That's the puzzle," Lestrade admitted. He opened his notebook to the sketch Constable Hendricks had made and passed it to Holmes. "These footprints were found on the balcony outside the boudoir. They appear in 4 inches of fresh snow, snow that fell between 9 in the evening and midnight. The prints begin 2 feet from the balcony door and end 6 feet further along, in the middle of the balcony. No trail leading to or from them. No ladder marks, no rope impressions, no disturbance of the snow on neighbouring rooftops." Watson rose from his chair and came to look over Holmes's shoulder at the sketch, his expression one of frank fascination. "Good Lord," he murmured. "It's as if someone simply materialized, walked a few paces, and vanished again." "Precisely what the maid believes," Lestrade said. "The household is in an uproar. The cook has accused the groom of witchcraft, the neighbour is spreading tales of devil's work, and I have a crime that by all physical evidence should be impossible." Holmes studied the sketch in silence, his long fingers tracing the outline of the prints, his expression one of intense concentration. The fire crackled softly, a log settling with a shower of sparks, and somewhere in the street below a church bell began to toll the hour, 10 slow, measured strokes that marked the morning's passage. Finally, Holmes looked up, and there was a gleam in his eye that Lestrade recognized, the look of a man who had just been handed a problem worthy of his attention. "The depth of these prints," Holmes said, tapping the sketch. "Your constable noted it was uniform throughout, exactly 1 3/4 inches. That struck you as significant, I presume." "It struck me as wrong," Lestrade replied. "When a man walks through snow, his weight shifts. The depth should vary." "Quite so." Holmes rose abruptly and began to pace, his dressing gown swirling around his ankles, his hands clasped behind his back. "And the edges. Your notes describe them as clean, almost sharp. Also inconsistent with natural walking, which compresses and disturbs the surrounding snow. This suggests—" He paused mid-stride, turning to face Lestrade. "But I am theorizing in advance. Of data. I must see these prints myself, and the room, and speak with the household. The game is afoot, Lestrade, and I thank you for bringing it to me." Watson had already moved to his desk, gathering his medical bag and notebook with the practiced efficiency of a man accustomed to sudden departures. "I'll fetch my coat," he said. "The weather's bitter, but I wouldn't miss this for anything." Lestrade felt a weight lift from his shoulders, the weight of professional isolation, of being the only man responsible for making sense of the senseless. He finished his tea in 3 warm swallows and stood, tucking his notebook back into his coat. "I've kept the scene as undisturbed as possible," he said. "Constable Hendricks is standing watch. The household has been instructed not to touch anything." "Excellent." Holmes was already moving toward his bedroom, calling back over his shoulder. "Give me 5 minutes to make myself presentable for public consumption. Watson, do ensure we have the measuring tape and the magnifying glass. And Lestrade." He paused in the doorway, looking back with something that might almost have been warmth. "Your instinct to consult me was sound. This case has interesting features." As Holmes disappeared to dress, Watson crossed to Lestrade and spoke quietly, his voice carrying the gentle reassurance of a man who understood the delicate pride of professional men. "You did the right thing coming here, Inspector. Holmes respects you. He wouldn't have agreed so readily otherwise. He saves his enthusiasm for puzzles that challenge him and for colleagues who bring him those puzzles honestly." Lestrade nodded, grateful for the kindness, and moved to the window while Watson gathered supplies. Below, Baker Street continued its morning business, indifferent to mysteries and footprints and impossible thefts. But here, in this cluttered room that smelled of tobacco and chemicals and old books, the machinery of solution had begun to turn. The hansom cab that carried them back to Welbeck Street moved with greater difficulty now, the morning traffic having thickened as London fully woke to its business. Lestrade sat facing forward, Holmes and Watson opposite, the three men settling into that companionable silence that comes when each knows his role and trusts the others to fulfill theirs. Through the cab's small windows, the city presented itself in tableau. A coal wagon stuck at an intersection, its driver coaxing the horse with patient words. A crossing sweeper clearing a path through slush, his broom working in steady rhythm. A flower girl standing beneath an awning, her violets looking almost impossibly delicate against the grey morning. Holmes sat with his eyes half closed, his fingers pressed together in that attitude of contemplation Lestrade had learned, meant the detective's mind was already at work, assembling and testing theories against the scaffolding of known facts. Watson had his notebook balanced on his knee, occasionally jotting observations, the temperature, the condition of the snow, the time elapsed since the crime. Good practice for a man who documented cases with the precision of a physician recording symptoms. The cab turned onto Welbeck Street, and Lestrade leaned forward slightly, feeling that quickening of attention that always came when returning to a crime scene with fresh resources. The Ashford townhouse stood mid-terrace, a respectable 4-story structure of dark brick with white-painted window frames and a glossy black door. Constable Hendricks waited on the front step, looking both alert and slightly frozen, his breath misting in the cold air. They alighted from the cab, and Lestrade made the brief introductions. Holmes acknowledged the constable with a curt nod, and immediately looked up at the building's facade, his gaze travelling from ground to roofline, cataloguing windows, drainpipes, architectural features, with the systematic attention of a surveyor. "The 3rd floor," he murmured. "That window there, I presume?" "Yes, Mr. Holmes," Hendricks replied, pointing. "The boudoir. The balcony runs along the front, accessible from both that room and the adjacent dressing chamber, though the dressing chamber's door was locked from inside as well." Holmes grunted acknowledgment and strode toward the entrance. Mrs. Ashford met them in the hallway, her composure holding despite evident strain. the kind of brittle courtesy that kept respectable households functioning even in crisis. She recognized Lestrade and inclined her head, then turned questioning eyes to his companions. "Mrs. Ashford, may I present Mr. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson?" Lestrade said. "Mr. Holmes is a consulting detective. I've asked him to examine the scene." Something flickered across her face. Relief, perhaps, or the kind of hope that comes when one has exhausted ordinary solutions and must turn to extraordinary ones. "Of course, Inspector. Please, gentlemen, come upstairs. Jenny, our maid, has been beside herself. Perhaps you can put her mind at ease." They climbed to the 3rd floor, their footsteps muffled by carpet runners, the house's warmth a welcome contrast to the street's bite. The boudoir looked exactly as Lestrade had left it 2 hours earlier, preserved in that peculiar stillness that settles over rooms where normal life has been suspended by investigation. The pale blue wallpaper, the dressing table with its absence, the balcony doors now closed against the cold. Holmes moved immediately to those doors, opening them with care, and stepping out onto the narrow balcony. The temperature dropped instantly. The space was unheated, open to the elements, and the iron railing radiated cold, like a living thing. Lestrade and Watson followed, while Mrs. Ashford remained inside, watching from the warmth. The footprints remained as impossibly strange as they had been at dawn. 4 clear impressions, beginning from nothing, ending in nothing, frozen now, in snow that had begun to crust slightly as the morning sun touched it. Holmes dropped to one knee without hesitation, ignoring the snow that immediately began soaking through his trouser leg, and drew out a magnifying glass from his coat pocket. For several minutes he said nothing, examining each print in turn with absolute concentration. He measured the depth at multiple points with a small ruler produced from another pocket, noted the exact spacing between prints, studied the edges where snow had been compressed versus where it remained undisturbed. Watson stood back, giving him room, occasionally making notes when Holmes murmured measurements aloud. 1 3/4 inches, consistent throughout, Holmes said quietly, almost to himself. No variation for weight distribution, no evidence of melting and refreezing. The edges. He leaned closer, his nose nearly touching the snow. "Watson, your assessment of the temperature when this snow fell?" Watson consulted his notes. "The Meteorological Office reported temperatures between 28 and 32 degrees Fahrenheit last evening, cold enough that the snow would have remained powdery rather than wet. Yet these edges are remarkably defined for powdery snow," Holmes replied. He straightened and looked out across the neighbouring rooftops, his eyes narrowing in calculation. "Lestrade, the distance to the nearest roof?" 12 feet, perhaps 13, Lestrade answered. "I measured earlier." "And the height differential?" "Near level, perhaps 18 inches lower than this balcony at most." Holmes walked to the railing and gripped it, testing its stability, then leaned out to examine the space between buildings. The gap was substantial, but not impossible. Lestrade had already considered whether someone might have leaped across, though the lack of any disturbance on the neighbouring roof had discouraged that theory. "No marks on the opposite roof," Holmes observed. "No disturbance of the snow whatsoever. Interesting." He turned back to the prints and crouched again, this time examining the area between them and the balcony door. And here, between the door and where the prints begin, absolutely undisturbed snow, as if our mysterious visitor simply appeared 2 feet from the threshold. Watson cleared his throat gently. Could someone have jumped from the doorway, landed 2 feet out, walked 6 feet, and then jumped back, perhaps, landing in the exact same disturbed area without creating new impressions? Holmes shook his head. Improbable. More to the point, why engage in such gymnastics? If one can reach the balcony, one can walk normally upon it. He stood and brushed snow from his knee. No, this is theatre. Someone wanted these prints to appear impossible. The question is, why? They returned inside, where warmth embraced them like a presence. Mrs. Ashford had been joined by a young woman, Jenny, the maid, who stood twisting her hands in her apron, her eyes red from crying, but her expression hopeful at the sight of the visitors. Holmes turned to her with unexpected gentleness, his voice losing its usual crisp detachment. You discovered the theft, I understand. Can you tell me precisely what you saw when you entered this room? Jenny's voice came small but steady. I came in at 6, sir, like always, to open the curtains and lay the fire. The room was cold. It's always cold at that hour. And when I drew back the curtains, I looked out and saw... She faltered, then pushed on. I saw the footprints, sir. They glowed almost, in the early light, like someone had walked across the snow and just vanished. I thought... She stopped, embarrassed. You thought you had witnessed something supernatural, Holmes said matter-of-factly. A reasonable conclusion given the evidence before you. But tell me, when you opened the curtains, were the balcony doors still latched? Yes, sir, latched and bolted, just as Mrs. Ashford had left them. And the jewel box, when did you notice it was missing? Not until Mrs. Ashford came in, perhaps 10 minutes later. I had been that upset about the prints, you see. I ran to fetch Mrs. Ashford, and when we returned together, that's when she saw the box was gone. Holmes nodded and moved to the dressing table, examining the space where the box had sat. He ran his finger along the polished wood, checking for scratches or disturbance of the thin layer of powder that accumulated on all furniture, despite the best housekeeping. He opened the small drawers, peered at their contents without touching, then straightened and turned his attention to the room's other features. The chimney, he said suddenly, looking up at the fireplace. Does it connect to other floors? It's a shared flue with the drawing-room below, Mrs. Ashford answered. But the opening is far too narrow for a person, Mr. Holmes. We've had sweeps through regularly. I'm certain you have. Holmes crossed to the fireplace and Mark crouched before it, examining the grate and the surrounding brickwork. He reached up into the chimney, his arm disappearing into shadow, and when he withdrew it, his fingers were black with soot but empty of anything revelatory. No, he murmured, not the chimney. He stood and walked the perimeter of the room, his eyes moving constantly, cataloguing everything. Watson had settled into a chair by the window, his notebook open, watching his friend work with the fond familiarity of long practice. Lestrade remained near the door, giving Holmes space while staying close enough to observe method. Holmes paused at the window that faced the street, not the balcony doors, but a smaller window on the room's north wall. He examined the frame, the latch, the sill, then opened it and looked out. Below lay a narrow service alley between this building and the next, accessible from the street, but gated. He studied it for a long moment, then closed the window and moved on. Mrs. Ashford, he said, without turning. Your household staff. How many, and how long have they been in your employ?" "6 in total," she replied. "Jenny has been with us 3 years. Thomas, our groom, 5 years. Cook, 8 years. The scullery maid is new, only 6 months. We have a day charwoman who comes twice weekly, and a boy who tends the fires and runs errands." "And last night? Where was each person?" She recounted what she had already told Lestrade: the sleeping arrangements, the timing, the impossibility of any servant reaching the 3rd floor undetected. Holmes listened without comment, his eyes still roaming the room as if the walls themselves might confess their secrets. Finally, he turned to Lestrade. "I should like to speak with the groom, Thomas, was it? And to examine the roof access. Also, if possible, to view the neighbouring property's rooftops from above." "The groom is in the stable," Mrs. Ashford said. "I'll send Jenny to fetch him. As for the roof, the access is through the attic. I'll have Constable Hendricks show you." "Excellent." Holmes's energy had shifted. Lestrade recognized the signs of a mind engaged, theories forming and being tested against observation. "Watson, bring the measuring tape. Lestrade, your presence would be valuable. I may need official authority to examine neighbouring properties." They left Mrs. Ashford and Jenny in the boudoir and followed Constable Hendricks up a narrow servant stair to the attic, a low-ceilinged space smelling of dust and old wool, filled with the expected detritus of respectable life. Trunks, hat-boxes, furniture under holland covers, and in the far corner a small door that opened onto a ladder leading to the roof hatch. The climb was awkward, the ladder steep, but they emerged one by one onto the rooftop, and the view that greeted them was worth the effort. London spread in all directions, a landscape of chimneys and slate, snow-covered and strange in the pale winter light. The Thames lay invisible in the distance, but its presence announced itself in the cold moisture of the air. Smoke rose from countless chimneys, vertical columns in the still morning, and the sounds of the city, church bells, street vendors, the eternal rumble of commerce, rose, muffled but persistent. Holmes walked to the edge, facing the neighbouring terrace, and stood, looking down at the balcony below, then across at the matching roof 12 feet distant. He pulled out his measuring tape and enlisted Watson's help in determining exact distances, angles, heights. He examined the snow on their own roof carefully, looking for disturbances, finding none. "There," he said suddenly, pointing to something on the neighbouring roof that Lestrade could barely see, a small irregularity near the chimney stack. "We need to examine that roof. Lestrade, can you arrange access?" Lestrade nodded and descended to street level, where a brief conversation with the neighbouring household's butler secured grudging permission. 20 minutes later, they stood on the adjacent roof, and Holmes moved immediately to the spot he had indicated. There, caught on the brickwork of the chimney, was a scrap of dark fabric. Wool, by the look of it, perhaps 2 inches square. Holmes extracted it with tweezers and held it up to the light, examining the weave. "From a coat," Watson observed, "or a cloak." "Quite possibly." Holmes placed it carefully in an envelope from his pocket. "And here, do you see?" He pointed to a slight depression in the snow near the roof's edge. "Something rested here, something long and narrow, a plank, perhaps, removed before the snow stopped falling, leaving only the faintest impression." Lestrade felt understanding begin to dawn, pieces aligning. "A bridge," he said. "Someone crossed from this roof to the Ashford balcony." "Someone crossed," Holmes agreed. But how did they leave no prints on this end? And how did they create the prints on the balcony without walking in them? He smiled, a thin, satisfied expression. The answer, I begin to suspect, is that they did not walk at all, not in the conventional sense. Come, gentlemen, I believe I need to conduct one more interview, and then I shall be ready to explain this particular impossibility. The return to Baker Street occurred in late afternoon, when the winter sun had already begun its descent toward the rooftops, casting long shadows across the snow-covered streets and painting the city in shades of amber and grey. The cab ride passed in near silence. Holmes lost in thought, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, his eyes half closed in that attitude of intense concentration that Watson had learned not to interrupt. Lestrade sat opposite, turning over in his mind the interview they had just concluded with Thomas the groom, a quiet man with honest eyes and calloused hands, who had answered every question with the patience of someone accustomed to being suspected simply for his station in life. The groom had been in the stable all night, he maintained, nursing a mare with colic. His hands had smelled of horse and liniment, his clothes bore the stains of a night's veterinary work, and his alibi, if it could be called that, was confirmed by the mare herself, who stood in her stall looking considerably improved, but still tender. Holmes had examined the stable with the same attention he brought to every space, noting the arrangement of tools, the height of the loft, the narrow window that looked out toward the main house. He had asked about ladders, about planks, about whether Thomas knew carpentry or stagecraft. The answers had been simple, direct, unrevealing. Now, as the cab drew up before 221B, Holmes stirred from his reverie and spoke for the first time since leaving Welbeck Street. "I believe I have it," he said quietly, "or most of it. There remains the question of motive, which is always the more human and therefore the more unpredictable element. But the method, yes, the method is clear." Watson gathered his bag and notebook, and Lestrade followed the two men into the building, back up the familiar 17 steps, into the sitting room where the fire had been maintained in their absence, and tea awaited on the sideboard, courtesy of Mrs. Hudson's reliable stewardship. Holmes shrugged out of his coat and went immediately to the cluttered table, sweeping aside chemical apparatus and newspapers to clear a space. He retrieved a blank sheet of paper and a pencil, his movements quick and purposeful, and began to sketch with surprising artistic skill the outline of a building, a balcony, the gap between roofs. "Sit, gentlemen," he said without looking up. "Watson, tea if you please. Lestrade, you've been patient with my silence. Let me now repay that patience with explanation." Lestrade settled into his customary chair, accepting the cup Watson handed him, and watched as Holmes's sketch took shape. The detective worked quickly, adding details, the footprints on the balcony, the neighbouring roof, the chimney where the fabric had been found. "The essential problem," Holmes began, still drawing, "is one of apparent impossibility. Footprints that begin and end in empty air. A locked room, or locked balcony, rather, accessed by someone who left no trace of entry or exit. The household's immediate resort to supernatural explanation is understandable, but, as always, premature. When we eliminate the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth." He set down the pencil and held up the sketch for them to see. "The prints themselves told me everything. Their uniform depth, their clean edges, their perfect spacing. These are not the characteristics of prints made by walking. They are the characteristics of prints made by pressing. Watson leaned forward. Pressing? You mean they were stamped into the snow? Precisely. Holmes crossed to his chemistry corner and rummaged through drawers until he found what he sought. A small block of wood, rectangular, smooth on one side. Imagine this carved on its bottom surface with the inverse of a boot print. Press it into snow of appropriate depth and you create a perfect impression. No variation in depth because the pressure is applied uniformly. No irregularity at the edges because the carved template is itself regular. Make 4 such impressions at walking intervals, and you create the appearance of someone having walked, without anyone actually walking. Lestrade set down his teacup, understanding dawning. But why create false prints at all? What purpose does it serve? Misdirection, Holmes replied, and delay. Consider, a theft occurs. Evidence is discovered that appears supernatural, or at least deeply mysterious. The household panics, speaks of devils and witchcraft. You are called in. You spend hours examining the impossible prints, questioning servants, seeking rational explanation for an irrational phenomenon. Meanwhile, what are you not doing? Searching for the thief, Lestrade said slowly. Following the actual trail. Exactly. The prints serve to freeze the investigation in place, to focus all attention on the how rather than the who or the why. Watson had begun taking notes, his pen moving quickly. But someone still needed to access that balcony. The doors were locked from inside, the window watched. How did they manage it? Holmes returned to his sketch and pointed to the gap between buildings. 12 feet. A daunting gap to leap, certainly. But what if one did not leap? What if one walked across? He drew a line between the roofs, a plank, narrow but solid, bridging the void. A simple wooden plank, perhaps 14 feet in length, to allow for overlap at each end, laid between this roof and the Ashford balcony. Our thief crosses carefully. I imagine the work was done before the snow began falling, for safety. Once across, they gain access to the balcony, bolt the doors from within, wait for the household to settle into sleep. When the snow begins, and yesterday's storm came quite suddenly, you'll recall, they see opportunity. Lestrade was beginning to see it now, the elegant simplicity beneath the apparent impossibility. They created the false prints during the snowfall. Or just after it ended, more likely. They waited for sufficient accumulation. 4 inches proved ideal. Then used their carved moulds to press the prints into the fresh snow. The prints begin part way along the balcony and end part way along, because they needed to reach out from the balcony door to place them without stepping in the snow themselves. Perhaps they lay prone, reaching as far as they could, creating the illusion of a path walked from nowhere to nowhere. Watson looked up from his notes, his brow furrowed. But surely their own prints would have remained, from before the snow or after? Ah! Holmes smiled, pleased by the question. That is where the scrap of fabric becomes significant. Imagine a large cloth, a horse blanket, perhaps, or a paint drop cloth, laid carefully across the balcony before the snow began. Our thief walks upon this cloth, and when the snow falls, it falls upon the cloth, not upon disturbed snow beneath. After creating the false prints, they carefully lift the cloth, now bearing its own accumulation of snow, and remove it, taking with them any evidence of their actual movements. What remains is pristine snow, disturbed only by the 4 phantom impressions. The room fell silent, save for the fire's crackle and the scratch of Watson's pen. Lestrade turned the theory over in his mind, testing it for weaknesses, finding none. It was brilliant in its simplicity. No magic required, no supernatural intervention, just careful planning, and a understanding of how snow falls and how attention is directed. "The plank," Lestrade said. "It would need to be removed before dawn, before anyone saw it. Indeed, I suspect it was withdrawn back to the neighbouring roof during the night, after the theft was complete. The depression I found near that roof's edge, something long and narrow had rested there, then been removed. Perhaps it was stored temporarily in the alley below, or carried away entirely. That will require further investigation." Holmes moved to the window and looked out at Baker Street, where lamplighters were beginning their evening rounds, touching flame to gas and bringing gentle light to the gathering dusk. The method is solved. What remains is the motive, and more importantly, the identity. Who had access to that neighbouring property? Who possessed the skill to carve convincing boot moulds? Who knew the Ashford household's routines well enough to choose their moment? And why risk such an elaborate scheme for £30 worth of jewels? Watson added. Why, indeed? Holmes turned back to face them, and there was something softer in his expression now, something almost sympathetic. "I suspect, Lestrade, that when we uncover the answer to that question, we will find not villainy but desperation, not greed but need. The care taken to avoid violence, the theatrical misdirection rather than simple smash and grab. These suggest someone who wished to avoid harm, who perhaps even felt regret for the necessity of theft." Lestrade stood, setting aside his empty teacup, and moved to stand beside Holmes at the window. Outside, London settled into its evening rhythms, indifferent to mysteries solved or unsolved. "You've given me the how, Mr. Holmes. That's more than I had this morning, the who and why. Those I can pursue with ordinary police work, now that I'm not chasing ghosts." "We'll pursue them together," Holmes corrected gently. "Tomorrow, I think. The day grows late, and even detectives require rest. But tomorrow we will trace the provenance of that fabric, investigate the neighbouring household, and perhaps speak with local craftsmen about carved wooden moulds. The truth is close now, Lestrade. I can feel it." Morning arrived with a different quality of light. The snow had begun to melt in earnest now, dripping from eaves in a steady rhythm that marked time like a patient clock, pooling in gutters where it caught the pale sun and sparkled briefly before continuing its journey toward the Thames. Lestrade had spent the previous evening at Scotland Yard, writing up Holmes's theory in language suitable for official reports, feeling that peculiar satisfaction that comes when chaos begins to resolve into pattern. He had slept better than he had in days, and now, standing once again on the steps of 221B Baker Street at 9:30, he felt the case's weight differently. No longer the crushing pressure of impossibility, but the manageable burden of methodical investigation. Holmes answered the door himself, already dressed for the day in a dark suit, his face clean-shaven and alert. "Lestrade, punctual as always? Come in. Watson is finishing breakfast, and Mrs. Hudson has graciously provided enough for 3. They climbed to the sitting-room, where Watson sat at the table with a plate of eggs and toast, the morning papers spread before him, his reading glasses perched on his nose. He looked up with a welcoming smile and gestured to the empty chair. "Inspector, Help yourself. The eggs are still warm, and the coffee is strong enough to wake the dead, as Mrs. Hudson puts it. Lestrade accepted gratefully, realizing he had left his lodgings without eating, too eager to resume the investigation. The three men shared the companionable silence of breakfast, the quiet punctuated only by the turning of newspaper pages and the clink of cutlery against china. Outside, the city sounds filtered up. Horses passing, vendors calling, the general murmur of London going about its business. Holmes finished first and pushed his plate aside, retrieving the envelope containing the fabric scrap from his desk. He held it up to the morning light streaming through the window. Examining it once more with that intensity he brought to all physical evidence. "Wool," he said. "Good quality, but not new. See here." He passed it to Lestrade. "The weave is tight, the material substantial. A winter coat, I should think, or a cloak. And notice this edge. It's not torn but cut. Snipped on something sharp. A nail, perhaps, or a protruding bit of brick. Our thief brushed against the chimney and lost a small piece of their garment without noticing." Lestrade studied the fabric, noting its dark colour, charcoal grey or perhaps black, difficult to say with certainty. "Can we trace it? Match it to a particular garment?" "Unlikely to prove anything in court," Watson observed, "even if we found the coat. A defence lawyer would argue that thousands of coats use similar material." "True," Holmes agreed, "but it narrows our search. We're looking for someone who had access to the neighbouring property on the night in question, someone who wore a dark wool coat or cloak, someone with the skill or resources to create carved wooden moulds and to execute a plan requiring both nerve and precision." He stood and began to pace, his hands clasped behind his back. "Yesterday, while you were at Scotland Yard, I made certain inquiries. The house next to the Ashfords is owned by a widow, Mrs. Cordelia Barrow, who lets rooms to professional gentlemen. Currently, she has 3 tenants. Lestrade set down the fabric and pulled out his notebook. "Their names?" "A clerk from the Admiralty, a music teacher, and a medical student from St. Bartholomew's Hospital." Holmes stopped pacing and turned to face them. "I took the liberty of visiting Mrs. Barrow yesterday evening. A charming woman, quite forthcoming once I explained I was investigating a matter of missing property. She confirmed that all 3 tenants were home on the night of the theft. She heard them moving about in their rooms, as one does in boarding houses where the walls are thin and the floors creak." "But did she see them?" Lestrade asked. "She saw the clerk and the music teacher at supper, which she provides as part of the arrangement. The medical student took his meal in his room. Apparently, he's preparing for examinations and keeps irregular hours." Watson looked up from his coffee. The medical student would have access to St. Bart's facilities, woodworking tools, perhaps, in the hospital's maintenance shops. "My thought exactly," Holmes said. "His name is Peter Hallowell, 24 years old, in his final year of study. Mrs. Barrow describes him as quiet, conscientious, always punctual with his rent. She did mention one thing of interest, however. He recently began courting someone. She's seen him with a young woman on several occasions, though he's been discreet about it." Lestrade felt the pieces beginning to shift, to suggest a pattern not yet clear. "What kind of young woman?" Mrs. Barrow's description was vague. "Respectable but modest," she said. "Someone who works for her living," she thought, based on the practical nature of her dress. They met on the steps once, and Mrs. Barrow noted that the young woman had calloused hands. "A servant," Watson said quietly. The word hung in the air, heavy with implication. Lestrade thought of the Ashford household. Jenny the maid, with her red eyes and twisted hands. Thomas the groom, with his patient dignity. The scullery maid so new to the position. He thought of the care taken to avoid violence, the theatrical misdirection, the modest value of the items stolen. Not greed, Holmes had said. Need. We should speak with this Hallowell, Lestrade said, already calculating how to approach it, officially or unofficially, with warrant or with conversation. Agreed, Holmes replied. But first, I think we should visit St. Bartholomew's. If our medical student created carved moulds, he may have left evidence of the work. Wood shavings, tools used, perhaps even the moulds themselves, if he felt confident they wouldn't be connected to him. They set out within the hour, taking a cab through streets where the melting snow had turned to slush, greyish and unprepossessing, revealing the cobblestones beneath in patches like a puzzle being slowly solved. St. Bartholomew's Hospital rose before them, ancient and stolid, its walls bearing the weight of centuries of healing and learning. Holmes led them not to the main entrance, but around to a side door that opened onto a warren of corridors leading to workshops and storage rooms. A porter intercepted them, but Holmes produced a card and spoke with the easy authority of someone accustomed to accessing restricted spaces. "We're making inquiries on behalf of Scotland Yard," he said, gesturing to Lestrade. "We need to speak with someone familiar with the students' use of the workshop facilities." The porter, a man of perhaps 60, with the measured movements of long service, nodded slowly. "That would be Mr. Griggs, the master carpenter. He oversees the maintenance shops and sometimes lets the students use the tools for their own projects. Makes medical instruments, some of them do, or anatomical models. Follow me." They wound through corridors that smelled of carbolic and sawdust, past rooms where the sounds of sawing and hammering echoed, until they reached a large workshop where a broad-shouldered man in a leather apron stood planing a length of wood. Mr. Griggs looked up at their approach, set down his plane with care, and wiped his hands on a rag. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying the pleasant roughness of someone who worked with his hands, and didn't mind the honest labour. Holmes made the introductions and came straight to the point. "We're interested in whether a medical student named Peter Hallowell has used these facilities recently, particularly for woodworking projects." Griggs's weathered face showed recognition. "Young Hallowell? Aye, he's been in here. Good lad, careful with the tools, always cleans up after himself. What's this about?" "What did he make?" Holmes asked, ignoring the question. The carpenter thought for a moment, scratching his chin. "Let me see. He was working on something peculiar a few weeks back. Said it was for a stage production. One of the teaching theatres was putting on a demonstration of forensic methods, he told me, and they needed props. He carved a pair of boot soles, reverse-like. I remember because it was odd work, very precise. Had to get the dimensions exactly right, he said. Watson and Lestrade exchanged glances, but Holmes's expression remained neutral. "Do you know what became of these carved soles?" "He took them when he finished. Said the production was next week, but—" Griggs frowned. "Come to think of it, I never heard about any such demonstration, and young Hallowell hasn't been back since. Usually he's in here at least once a week, working on one thing or another." Holmes produced the fabric scrap. Have you seen him wearing a dark wool coat, something that might match this material?" Griggs examined it briefly. "Could be any coat, Mr. Holmes. Half of London wears dark wool in winter." "Indeed." Holmes pocketed the fabric again. "If Mr. Hallowell should return, I'd appreciate word sent to Baker Street. But please, say nothing to him about our visit." The carpenter agreed, and they departed, emerging once more into the weak winter sunlight. The hospital's courtyard was busy with visitors coming and going, nurses in their crisp uniforms moving with purposeful haste, the sick being helped from carriages. Life continuing in its endless cycle of suffering and healing. "He made the moulds," Lestrade said as they walked toward the street. "That's as good as a confession." "It establishes means," Holmes corrected, "not motive, and not quite proof. A clever defense lawyer could argue he did indeed make them for a theatrical production that was subsequently cancelled. We need more." They returned to Welbeck Street as the church bells struck noon, finding the Ashford household in a state of subdued normalcy, the panic of the previous days settling into the resigned quiet that follows unexplained loss. Mrs. Ashford received them in the drawing-room, and Lestrade noted the weariness in her face, the way her hands moved restlessly in her lap. "Have you found who took my jewels, Inspector?" she asked, her voice carrying more resignation than hope. "We're close, Mrs. Ashford," Lestrade replied gently. "But I need to ask you some questions about your staff. Jenny, in particular." Something flickered across Mrs. Ashford's face. Concern, perhaps, or a suspicion she had been suppressing. "Jenny is a good girl. She's been with us 3 years. I can't believe she would—" "Has she seemed troubled recently?" Holmes interrupted, his tone conversational rather than accusatory. "Worried about anything? Distracted?" Mrs. Ashford hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Now that you mention it, yes. These past few weeks she's been elsewhere in her thoughts. I attributed it to young women's fancies. She's of an age where such things occupy the mind. But she's continued her work satisfactorily." "Has she mentioned courting anyone?" Watson asked. "A young man, perhaps?" The colour rose in Mrs. Ashford's cheeks, the flush of someone realizing they've overlooked something significant. I don't know. She's always been discreet about her private life. The servants have their half-day on Thursdays. What she does then is her own affair, so long as she returns by curfew." "We'd like to speak with her," Lestrade said, "if you'd be so kind as to send for her." Jenny appeared a few minutes later, her face pale, her hands trembling slightly as she stood in the doorway. She had the look of someone who's been expecting bad news and has finally received the summons to hear it. Holmes rose and approached her with unexpected gentleness, his voice soft, almost fatherly. "Jenny, we know about Peter Hallowell." The effect was immediate. The young woman's face crumpled, tears spilling down her cheeks, and she swayed slightly as if the words had physical weight. Mrs. Ashford gasped, but Holmes held up a hand for silence. "Sit down," he said to Jenny, guiding her to a chair. "No one here wishes you harm, but we must know the truth, all of it." Jenny sat with her hands clutched together in her lap, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs that she tried desperately to contain. Mrs. Ashford had gone very still in her chair, her face a portrait of confusion and dawning comprehension, while Lestrade stood by the window with his notebook ready but held loosely, as if he understood that this moment required something gentler than official interrogation. Watson had quietly moved to closed the drawing-room door, ensuring privacy, and now stood near it like a guardian, his medical instincts attuned to the young woman's distress. Holmes drew a chair close to Jenny's and sat, leaning forward slightly, his angular features softened by something approaching kindness. When he spoke, his voice carried none of its usual crisp detachment. "Jenny," he said quietly, "we know that Peter Hallowell created the footprints on the balcony. We know he accessed it from the neighbouring roof using a plank. We know he took Mrs. Ashford's jewel box. What we don't know, what we need to understand, is why." The young woman's breath came in ragged gasps as she struggled to compose herself. Finally, she looked up, her eyes red-rimmed, but meeting Holmes's gaze with a kind of desperate honesty. "He did it for me," she whispered. "I never asked him to. I never would have. But he knew I was desperate, and he thought he could help." Mrs. Ashford leaned forward, her voice gentle despite the shock. "Jenny? What are you talking about? Desperate for what?" The story came out in fragments, pulled from the young woman like threads from a tangled skein. She had met Peter Hallowell 6 months earlier at a Sunday service at St. Giles Church, where medical students sometimes came to hear the choir, and working girls came to find an hour of peace in their demanding weeks. They had begun walking out together on her half-days. Careful courtship conducted in parks and public places. Nothing improper, but growing steadily into something deeper. He was kind, she said. He listened when she spoke. He had plans for their future. He would finish his medical degree in 4 months, establish a practice, and then they would marry. A modest dream, perhaps, but one built on genuine affection and practical hope. "But my brother," Jenny continued, her voice breaking. "My younger brother Thomas, not the groom here, a different Thomas. He got himself into terrible trouble. Gambling debts. He's only 18, foolish and young, and he fell in with bad companions. They took him to places where men wager money they don't have, and he lost. Badly." Holmes's expression remained neutral, but Lestrade saw the detective's hands tighten slightly on the arms of his chair. "How much did he owe?" £35. The number came out like a confession of murder. "To a moneylender in Cheapside, a man named Garvey who doesn't forgive debts. He told Thomas he had until the end of January to pay, or he'd see him in prison. Or worse." She looked up at Mrs. Ashford with desperate pleading. "My wages are £8 a year, ma'am. I've saved what I could, but it's not nearly enough. Thomas is a good boy. He made a mistake, but he doesn't deserve what Garvey threatened." Watson moved quietly from his position by the door and knelt beside Jenny's chair, offering her his handkerchief. She took it gratefully and pressed it to her face, her whole body trembling. "So Peter decided to help," Holmes said, his tone carefully neutral, inviting rather than accusing. Jenny nodded miserably. "I told him about it because I had to tell someone. The weight of it was crushing me. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. He saw how it was destroying me. And he said he would think of something. I thought he meant he would lend us the money, perhaps, or help us find some legal way out of the debt. I never imagined—" She gestured helplessly toward the stairs, toward the 3rd floor, where the impossible crime had occurred. "Tell us about the night it happened," Lestrade said, his voice gentle but firm. "Everything you know." Jenny took a shuddering breath and continued. Peter had explained his plan to her 2 days before the theft. Not asking for permission, she insisted, but telling her what he intended to do. He had access to the roof of his boarding house through a door in the attic that Mrs. Barrow never locked. He had observed the Ashford households, routines during his visits to call on Jenny, noting that Mrs. Ashford kept her jewel box on the dressing table, that the balcony could be reached from the neighbouring roof, that the house settled into sleep by midnight most nights. He made those carved boot soles at the hospital workshop, Jenny said, telling the carpenter it was for some theatrical purpose. He brought them to show me, so proud of his cleverness. He said the footprints would confuse everyone, make them think it was impossible, give us time before anyone suspected anything real. Her voice dropped to a whisper. He thought he was being so clever. He thought no one would ever solve it. Holmes permitted himself a thin smile. He didn't account for Scotland Yard consulting me. The night it snowed, Jenny continued, Peter knew it was his opportunity. He waited until very late, after midnight, when he was certain everyone slept. He had prepared a plank, a longboard from the hospital's maintenance stores, and he laid it across the gap between the roofs. He told me afterward how frightening it was, crossing in the dark, 12 feet above the alley. But he made it. He had a cloth, a painter's drop cloth, he called it, that he spread on the balcony before it snowed too heavily. Then he waited. The room was utterly silent now, except for Jenny's voice and the gentle ticking of the mantel clock. Mrs. Ashford sat frozen, listening to the violation of her home described in the measured tones of confession. When the snow stopped falling, around midnight, he carefully lifted the cloth. It was covered in snow, he said, heavy with it, and set it aside on the balcony where it wouldn't be disturbed. Then he used the carved soles to press the footprints into the fresh snow, reaching out from the doorway as far as he could. He made them begin and end in the middle of the balcony, thinking it would look like magic, like something supernatural. And the jewel box? Watson asked quietly. He knew where. It was because I had mentioned it in passing. Stupid, careless me. I told him Mrs. Ashford kept her mother's locket there, sentimental things, mostly. He didn't know the exact value, but he hoped it would be enough. He opened the balcony doors from outside. The lock was simple, he said. Nothing that would resist a thin blade slipped between the frames. He took the box, relatched the doors from outside, rolled up the cloth with all its snow, withdrew the plank, and went back across to his own roof. He hid everything in the basement of the boarding house. The plank, the cloth, the carved soles, and he gave me the jewel box the next day. She reached into her apron pocket with trembling hands and withdrew something wrapped in a handkerchief. Unfolding it, revealed the lacquered box. Dark wood inlaid with mother of pearl, exactly as Mrs. Ashford had described it. She held it out toward her employer with shaking hands. I never opened it, she said, her voice barely audible. I couldn't. I told Peter I couldn't go through with it, that we had to return it somehow, find another way to help Thomas. But he said it was too late, that returning it would only make things worse, that we had to follow through. I've carried it with me every day since, terrified someone would find it, terrified of what I'd become. Mrs. Ashford took the box slowly, opening it to reveal its contents intact. The garnet brooch, the pearl necklace, the gold locket with her mother's portrait. Her hands trembled slightly as she touched the locket, then closed the box with care. You should have come to me, she said, her voice thick with emotion. Jenny, If you had told me about your brother's trouble, we might have found a way to help. I'm not a wealthy woman, but £35. We could have arranged something. A loan against your future wages, perhaps, or I could have spoken with Mr. Ashford about advancing your salary." Jenny's sobs came harder now, her whole body shaking with the weight of realization that the crime had been unnecessary, that confession might have solved what theft had only complicated. Holmes rose from his chair and moved to the window, looking out at the street where the last of the snow was melting into muddy rivulets. His voice, when he spoke, carried a peculiar gentleness. "Lestrade, you have your confession and your recovered property. The question now is what to do with them." The inspector moved from his position by the window and stood for a moment in silence, his notebook still unopened in his hand. He looked at Jenny, a girl of 19 who had made no crime herself, but had become entangled in one through love and fear. He looked at Mrs. Ashford, who held her jewel box with the care of someone who had just regained something precious. He thought of Peter Hallowell, a medical student 4 months from completing his degree, who had risked everything to help the woman he loved. The law was clear on theft. The punishment was certain: arrest, trial, likely imprisonment for Hallowell, possible prosecution for Jenny as an accessory. The young man's medical career would be destroyed before it began. Jenny would lose her position, her reputation, any hope of respectable employment. And Thomas, the foolish younger brother whose debts had set this all in motion, would likely still end up in debtor's prison or worse. But the law, Lestrade had learned over his years at Scotland Yard, was meant to serve justice, not merely to punish. And justice sometimes required mercy. "Mrs. Ashford," he said carefully, "you have your property returned. No damage was done to your home. The crime, while serious, was motivated not by greed, but by desperation to help a family member in trouble. What outcome do you wish to see here?" Mrs. Ashford sat very still, her eyes moving from the jewel box to Jenny's tear-stained face to Lestrade's weathered features. A long moment passed, marked by the clock's patient ticking. "I wish," she said finally, "for this to end quietly. Jenny has been a good servant for 3 years. She made a terrible mistake in not coming to me first, but I understand the fear and shame that prevented it. As for this young man, this Mr. Hallowell, I assume he's a decent person who made a desperate choice." She looked at Holmes. "Is that a fair assessment, Mr. Holmes?" "From what I've observed and heard, yes," Holmes replied. "Foolish, certainly. Reckless, undoubtedly. But not villainous. He saw someone he cared for in pain, and acted to relieve that pain through the only means he could conceive." Mrs. Ashford nodded slowly. "Then I see no reason to pursue prosecution. The property is returned. No harm was ultimately done." She turned to Jenny. "But there are conditions." The young woman looked up, hope and fear warring in her expression. "First, you will tell me immediately if you or anyone you love faces such trouble again. No more secrets, Jenny. If I'm to trust you in my household, I must. Know you'll come to me in times of need." "Yes, ma'am," Jenny whispered. "Second, this young man of yours, this Peter Hallowell, will come here tomorrow and make his own apology to me directly. I want to see the measure of him, and he will find legitimate work to repay what he has cost me in distress and loss of peace, even if the physical items are returned. Yes, ma'am, I'll tell him. He'll come, I promise." "And third," Mrs. Ashford's voice softened, when he completes his medical degree and establishes himself. And if you two still wish to marry, you'll invite me to the wedding, because I should like to know that something good came from this dreadful business." Jenny's sobs turned to something between tears and laughter, and she reached for Mrs. Ashford's hand, pressing it to her forehead in a gesture of gratitude and submission. Lestrade closed his notebook without having written a single word. "Then the case is closed," he said quietly. "The jewels are recovered, the method is solved, and justice is served through mercy rather than punishment." He looked at Holmes. "Does that satisfy your sense of proper resolution, Mr. Holmes?" Holmes turned from the window, and there was something in his expression that might have been approval, or perhaps relief that the world still held room for compassion alongside reason. "It does," he said simply, "though I would add one more condition, if I may." Mrs. Ashford looked at him inquiringly. "The moneylender? This Garvey who preys on foolish boys and their desperate sisters? I assume the debt still stands." Jenny nodded miserably. Peter was going to pawn the jewels, pay off Thomas's debt with the money. But since I wouldn't let him... Holmes reached into his coat and withdrew a leather wallet. From it he counted out £35 in notes, laying them on the table with careful precision. "I shall pay the debt," he said. "Consider it payment for one of the more interesting puzzles I've encountered this winter. But Thomas, your brother, will come to Baker Street next week and speak with me. If he's old enough to gamble, he's old enough to learn the consequences and to make restitution through honest work. I have clients who occasionally need reliable young men for legitimate labour. He'll work off this debt to me, and perhaps learn something about the value of money earned rather than wagered." Jenny stared at the money as if it were salvation itself made tangible. "Mr. Holmes, we couldn't possibly—" "You can, and you will," Holmes said firmly, "because the alternative is watching your brother destroyed, your young man imprisoned, and yourself cast out. This way, everyone learns, everyone grows, and everyone has the chance to make better choices in future." Lestrade watched this exchange with quiet satisfaction. This was the side of Holmes the public rarely saw, the man beneath the deductive machine, the human heart that beat alongside the brilliant mind. It was the side that made their partnership not just professional, but meaningful. Mrs. Ashford rose and extended her hand to Holmes. "Thank you, Mr. Holmes, for solving the mystery, yes, but more for solving it with wisdom." As they prepared to leave, Lestrade paused at the drawing-room door and looked back at Jenny, who still sat clutching Watson's handkerchief, the weight of the world lifted from her young shoulders. "One more thing," he said gently. "Mr. Holmes told you that winter plays tricks on people. But remember, men play bigger ones. Next time you face trouble, choose wisely who you trust and how you ask for help." Jenny nodded, and they left her there with Mrs. Ashford, two women separated by class and station, but united now by an understanding of fear, forgiveness, and the complicated mercy of second chances. 3 days had passed since the resolution at the Ashford residence, and London had transformed itself once again, the way cities do when seasons shift and weather changes its mind. The snow that had blanketed the streets in white silence had retreated under persistent sun and warmer air, leaving behind the damp, earthy smell of stone and brick emerging from winter's grip. The cobblestones gleamed with moisture, puddles collected in the uneven places where cartwheels had worn grooves over decades, and from every eave and gutter came the steady drip of melting ice, a liquid metronome, marking the passage from one state to another. Inspector Lestrade sat at his desk in Scotland Yard, the morning light slanting through the tall windows and illuminating the careful stacks of case files that represented his week's work. Before him lay the report on the Ashford matter, official language describing the recovery of stolen property, the resolution of the case through private negotiation, the decision not to pursue prosecution in the interests of all parties involved. It was, by the standards of police work, an unusual conclusion, but not an unprecedented one. The law allowed for discretion, particularly in cases where restitution had been made and the victims expressed no desire for punishment. He had written it carefully, knowing that his superiors would read it, with the skeptical eye of men who preferred clear arrests and straightforward convictions. But he had also written it honestly, noting that the crime had been motivated by desperation rather than greed, that the perpetrator had shown immediate remorse, and that the victim herself had advocated for mercy. If pressed, he could defend every decision, and if questioned about consulting Sherlock Holmes, he could point to the successful resolution, property recovered, method explained, household peace restored. The case file lay open to the sketch Constable Hendricks had made of the impossible footprints, those phantom impressions that had begun and ended in empty air, defying reason until reason had been properly applied. Lestrade studied them now with satisfaction, understanding how easily the eye could be deceived, how readily the mind reached for supernatural explanation when faced with carefully constructed misdirection. The prints had been the key to everything, too perfect to be real, too deliberate to be anything but artifice. He closed the file and placed it in the cabinet marked Resolved, 1886, where it would rest among the year's other concluded investigations. The small sound of the drawer sliding shut carried a finality that pleased him. Another puzzle solved. Another piece of London's endless chaos rendered orderly through patient investigation. A knock at his office door interrupted his thoughts, and Constable Hendricks entered, his young face bright with the particular eagerness of an officer who had learned something from a case and wanted to demonstrate that learning. "Sir," he said, "I wanted to thank you for allowing me to assist with the Ashford investigation. I've been thinking about those footprints, how I assumed they were genuine, because they looked so convincing. It's taught me to question even what seems obvious." Lestrade permitted himself a small smile. "A valuable lesson, Hendricks. The best criminals are often the best actors. They create scenes designed to mislead. Our job is to look past the performance to the mechanism underneath." "Mr. Holmes made it seem so simple," Hendricks said, with the admiration of youth encountering expertise. The way he examined the prints and immediately understood they'd been pressed rather than walked. "Holmes has particular gifts," Lestrade acknowledged, "but don't discount ordinary police work. We gathered the evidence, preserved the scene, documented the facts. Holmes simply organized those facts into a pattern we couldn't see. Both approaches are necessary." Hendricks nodded thoughtfully and withdrew, leaving Lestrade alone with his thoughts and the quiet satisfaction of work completed well. Outside his window, Scotland Yard's courtyard bustled with the usual traffic. Officers coming and going, prisoners being transferred, the great machinery of law enforcement grinding through another day. Somewhere in that machinery, other inspectors faced their own impossible cases, their own locked rooms and phantom criminals. Some would solve them, others would not, but all would persist, because that was what the work required. Lestrade rose from his desk and reached for his coat. The afternoon stretched before him with no urgent cases demanding attention, and he found himself wanting to walk, to move through the city and observe how it had changed in a matter of days, how life had continued regardless of small dramas in third-floor boudoir. Across London, in the cluttered sitting-room at 221B Baker Street, Dr. John Watson sat at his writing desk with a fresh sheet of paper before him, his pen poised over the blank surface, while his mind worked through the problem of how to tell a story that was both true and discreet. The Ashford case had all the elements his readers enjoyed: an impossible crime, an ingenious solution, Holmes's brilliant deduction, but it also contained elements that required careful handling. Real people's lives and reputations hung in the balance. He had already decided to change the names. Jenny would become Margaret, or perhaps Ellen. Peter Hallowell would be rendered anonymous or transformed into a composite figure. The Ashfords deserved their privacy, and the agreement that had resolved the case depended on discretion. But the core of the story, the phantom of footprints, the locked balcony, the clever misdirection, those could be preserved without identifying anyone involved. Watson wrote a few exploratory lines, testing the voice. It was during the winter of 1886 that Holmes and I were consulted on one of the more peculiar cases to cross his threshold, a theft that appeared to involve supernatural intervention, or, at the very least, a criminal capable of defying the laws of physics. He paused, considering. Perhaps too dramatic for an opening. The story's real heart lay not in the impossibility, but in the human desperation underneath it. A young man trying to save his beloved's brother from ruin. A maid caught between loyalty and fear. A widow choosing mercy over vengeance. Holmes's voice interrupted his thoughts. Still wrestling with how to make me sufficiently heroic, Watson? Watson looked up to find his friend standing by the chemistry table, where he had been conducting some experiment involving a series of test tubes and substances that produced occasional small puffs of coloured smoke. Holmes had abandoned his dressing gown for proper attire, a sign that he expected visitors or planned to venture out. "I'm trying to determine how much detail to include," Watson replied. "The method is brilliant and deserves recording, but the people involved deserve protection." "Then change the details that identify them and preserve the ones that instruct," Holmes said, returning his attention to his experiment. "The footprints are the point. How they were made, why they succeeded in deceiving, how careful observation revealed their true nature. The rest is simply human drama, which occurs in every case and rarely varies in its essential patterns." "You're rather cavalier about human drama for someone who just paid £35 to save a young man from debtor's prison," Watson observed mildly. Holmes made a dismissive gesture with the hand not holding a pipette. "That was an investment in future behaviour, not sentimentality. The boy will work off his debt, learn the value of money honestly earned, and perhaps think twice before wagering what he cannot afford to lose. Young Hallowell will complete his medical degree without the burden of criminal prosecution and presumably become a productive member of society. Jenny will keep her position and her prospects. Everyone benefits, and I gain the satisfaction of having solved an interesting puzzle. Simple economics, Watson." Watson smiled, recognizing the deflection for what it was. Holmes could dress his compassion in the language of logic and utility, but the underlying kindness remained visible to anyone who knew him well. He returned to his manuscript, making notes about what to preserve and what to obscure. The fire crackled softly in its grate. The afternoon sun moved across the floor in its slow arc, and the companionable silence of Baker Street settled around them like a familiar blanket. This was the rhythm Watson had come to treasure. The intense activity of investigation followed by these quieter moments of reflection and documentation, the partnership that balanced Holmes's brilliance with his own more grounded perspective. A knock at the door announced Mrs. Hudson, who entered bearing a tea tray and a small package wrapped in brown paper. "This just arrived for you, Mr. Holmes," she said, setting down both tray and package. A young man delivered it, very nervous, kept thanking me profusely, even though I'd done nothing but answer the door. Holmes opened the package to reveal a carefully carved wooden box, simple in design, but executed with obvious skill. Inside lay a brief note written in careful script. "Mr. Holmes, I cannot adequately express my gratitude for your discretion and your generosity. This box is my own work, made in the hospital workshop under proper supervision this time. I hope you will accept it as a token of my sincere appreciation and my commitment to making better choices in future. I begin work next week on the projects you arranged, and I will not disappoint you. With deepest respect, Peter Hallowell." Holmes examined the box with the same attention he brought to all crafted objects, noting the precision of the joints, the smoothness of the finish, the care evident in every detail. "The boy has talent," he murmured. "Perhaps he'll make a decent surgeon after all. The hand that can carve wood this precisely can certainly manage delicate medical procedures." Mrs. Hudson, who had been pouring tea, paused and looked at Holmes with that expression of fond exasperation she reserved for moments when his humanity showed through his detachment. "You're a good man, Mr. Holmes, no matter how much you pretend otherwise. I'm a consulting detective, Mrs. Hudson. Goodness has nothing to do with it." She humphed softly and departed, leaving them with tea and biscuits, and the afternoon stretching peacefully ahead. On Welbeck Street, in the Ashford household, life had found a new equilibrium, different from before, but stable in its own way. Jenny moved through her duties with the careful attention of someone who had been given a second chance and understood its value. The fear that had haunted her for weeks had lifted, replaced by a quieter emotion, gratitude mixed with determination to prove herself worthy of the mercy she'd received. Mrs. Ashford had been true to her word, speaking with her husband about extending a small loan to cover the moneylender's debt before learning that Mr. Holmes had already addressed it. Instead, they had established a modest savings account in Jenny's name, depositing a few pounds each quarter as a hedge against future emergencies, a practical kindness that acknowledged the realities of service life. Peter Hallowell had indeed visited, presenting himself at the front door with the humility of a man genuinely ashamed of his actions. Mrs. Ashford had received him in the drawing-room, and their conversation had lasted nearly an hour, long enough for her to assess his character, explain the harm his actions had caused despite his good intentions, and outline her expectations for his future behavior. He had left with his dignity intact, but his pride appropriately humbled, and with a clear understanding that his relationship with Jenny could continue only under the condition of absolute honesty and proper conduct. The jewel box had been returned to its place on the dressing table, its contents undisturbed, but Mrs. Ashford found she looked at it differently now. It was no longer simply a repository of sentimental items, but a reminder of how quickly ordinary life could be disrupted by hidden desperation, and how the choice between punishment and mercy could alter the trajectory of multiple lives. She stood at the boudoir window now, looking out at the balcony where the impossible footprints had appeared. The snow had melted completely, leaving the iron railing wet and gleaming in the afternoon sun, and the space looked ordinary again, just a narrow platform for taking air on pleasant evenings, nothing mysterious or threatening about it. But she would remember. She would remember that appearances could deceive, that the impossible often had simple explanations, and that the people who served in her household carried their own hidden burdens and fears. It had made her, she thought, a better employer, more attentive, more willing to listen. As evening settled over, London, the city lights began their nightly ritual. Gas lamps flickering to life along the streets, candles and oil lamps glowing in windows, the great dome of St. Paul standing sentinel over it all. The temperature had dropped again, reminding everyone that winter still held a few weeks of authority despite the melting snow, and smoke rose from countless chimneys in vertical columns that merged and dispersed against the darkening sky. In Baker Street, Holmes had finally abandoned his chemistry experiment and settled into his armchair with his pipe, his long legs stretched toward the fire, his expression one of contentment. Watson had finished his preliminary draft and now read the evening paper, occasionally reading aloud items of interest. Political developments, a new exhibition at the British Museum, the latest theatrical productions. "Listen to this," Watson said. "The Meteorological Office predicts more snow next week. Apparently, this winter isn't finished with us yet." "London in snow is a different city," Holmes observed, smoke drifting lazily from his pipe. "Everything muffled and softened. Footprints become narratives written in white. The usual chaos simplified into something almost comprehensible." "You sound almost poetic," Watson said with mild surprise. "I sound observational," Holmes corrected. "Poetry requires metaphor and emotion. I simply describe what is." But Watson noticed that his friend's gaze had drifted to the window, where beyond the glass, Baker Street was settling into its evening quiet. And he suspected that Holmes was thinking not of meteorology, but of Jenny and Peter Hallowell, of Mrs. Ashford's unexpected mercy, of the wooden box that now sat on the mantelpiece beside the Persian slipper, and the accumulated oddments of previous cases. The fire burned low, comfortable rather than blazing, and the room's warmth wrapped around them like a blessing. Somewhere in the street below, a street vendor called the last of his wares, chestnuts probably, roasted and warm, perfect for cold hands on winter evenings. The sound drifted up and faded, absorbed into the general murmur of London going about its eternal business. Lestrade would file his report. Watson would refine his manuscript. The Ashfords would continue their respectable life with perhaps a bit more wisdom. Peter Hallowell would finish his medical degree and begin his practice. Jenny would serve faithfully and save her modest wages. Thomas, the foolish younger brother, would work off his debt and hopefully learn something valuable from his near disaster. and the snow would melt completely, then return, then melt again, as it had done for centuries and would do for centuries more. The city would change and remain the same. Crimes would be committed and solved, or committed and remain mysteries. People would make terrible choices and wise ones, often in close succession. The world would turn. But for now, in this moment, in this room, where firelight danced on walls lined with books and the remnants of previous investigations, there was peace. The kind of peace that comes not from the absence of complexity, but from its resolution. Not perfect, perhaps, but good enough, human enough. Holmes stirred from his reverie and looked at Watson with something that might have been affection. "Well, Watson," he said quietly, "another case concluded. What shall we do tomorrow?" "Rest, I should think," Watson replied. "You've had quite a week." "Rest is for the unimaginative," Holmes said, "but without heat. Though I suppose one quiet day wouldn't be entirely objectionable." And so the evening deepened into night, and Baker Street settled into sleep. And somewhere in the great sprawling complexity of London, 1,000 stories continued, some destined to cross Holmes's threshold, others to remain forever private, all of them part of the endless tapestry of human existence in a city that never quite rested, never quite stopped, never quite lost its capacity to surprise even those who thought they had seen everything. The snowprint with no owner had been explained. The mystery had been solved. The impossible had been rendered merely improbable, and then simply understood. And in the end, that was enough.